Welcome to Unknown Suspect, the channel where silence hides secrets and every detail matters. Join legendary detective Hercule Poirot as he unravels mysteries built on deception, logic, and the power of observation. Settle in, listen closely, and remember, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Chapter 1. A letter that refused to be ignored. Hercule Poirot valued order above all things. On that mild spring morning, order reigned within his quiet countryside residence. The curtains were drawn at precisely the correct angle to admit sunlight without glare. His breakfast tray rested neatly on the table, toast evenly buttered, tea brewed to the exact shade of amber he preferred. Even the ticking of the small mantel clock seemed measured, respectful of the calm. Poirot adjusted the tips of his moustache with habitual care and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. A peaceful morning was a rare luxury, and he intended to enjoy it. The knock at the door broke the stillness. It was not sharp or urgent, merely polite, almost hesitant. Poirot frowned slightly. He had no appointments, no callers expected. Still, curiosity stirred. He rose, smoothed his jacket, and opened the door. The village postman stood on the step, cap in hand, cheeks flushed from cycling the lanes. He greeted Poirot with a courteous nod and passed him a small bundle of letters before departing without delay. Poirot closed the door and turned back inside. He placed the letters on the side table and poured himself another cup of tea. Only after settling into his armchair did he examine the post. Most of it was unremarkable: advertisements, notices, an invitation he had no intention of accepting. Then his eyes paused on one envelope that did not belong with the rest. It was pale blue. The handwriting was uneven, as though the writer's hand had trembled. The address was careful but strained, each letter pressed with anxious determination. Poirot lifted it gently. "Ah," he murmured, "this one carries emotion." He opened the envelope with care. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, written edge to edge in hurried, looping script. He read slowly, absorbing not just the words, but the feeling behind them. The letter was a plea. The writer, Ellen Preston, begged for help. Her sister, Margaret, had been accused of murdering her employer, a man named Lawrence Dane. Margaret worked as a maid at a large country house called Morningside. She had been found in her employer's study, holding a knife, while he lay lifeless on the floor. Despite her protestations, the authorities were convinced of her guilt. "She is innocent," the letter insisted. "She could never do such a thing." Poirot read the letter a second time, then a third. He noted the urgency, the fear, and most telling of all, the certainty. Ellen Preston did not merely hope her sister was innocent, she knew it. Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers. In his experience, guilt and innocence revealed themselves not in loud declarations, but in subtle details, in the way words were chosen, in what was emphasized and what was not. This letter carried no attempt at clever persuasion, no elaborate defense. It was raw, desperate, and sincere. Poirot's eyes lingered on one particular passage. "Everyone says it is obvious, but I beg you not to believe the obvious." A small smile touched his lips. "The obvious," Poirot said softly, "is very often the greatest trap of all." He set the letter down and rose from his chair, pacing slowly across the room. The situation described was not unfamiliar to him. A servant discovered at the scene, a weapon in hand. No immediate explanation. Such cases were swiftly concluded by those eager for certainty. But Poirot had learned long ago that certainty achieved too quickly was rarely correct. He returned to the letter and studied the final lines. Ellen Preston lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of a neighboring village. She had heard of Poirot's reputation, and believed, perhaps foolishly, she admitted, that he might see what others had overlooked. Poirot folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. There was, he reflected, a particular danger in large houses. They appeared orderly, respectable, even serene. Yet behind their walls simmered tensions, resentments, ambitions, secrets, quietly accumulating until something gave way. And when something did, it was often the most vulnerable who were blamed. Poirot walked to the window and looked out over the garden, where early blossoms stirred gently in the breeze. The world appeared peaceful, unchanged. Yet somewhere not far away, a frightened young woman sat confined, her fate sealed by assumption rather than truth. He felt the familiar stirring within him, the call of the puzzle, the moral weight of injustice. "This is no small matter," he said to himself. "If the wrong conclusion has been reached, then it must be corrected." Poirot returned to his desk and reached for his notebook. He jotted down the names: Margaret Preston, Ellen Preston, Lawrence Dane, Morningside House. Already questions formed in his mind. Who was Lawrence Dane? What sort of man inspired such desperation? Why had the maid been alone with him at that moment? And most importantly, who benefited from her silence? Poirot's lips tightened thoughtfully. In cases such as these, it was rarely about a single act. It was about pressure, slow, relentless pressure applied from many directions until someone broke. The true tragedy lay not always in violence, but in the failure to see despair before it consumed reason. He closed his notebook and moved with quiet purpose through the room, setting aside his unfinished tea, straightening his jacket, and reaching for his hat. A peaceful morning had been offered to him. He declined it. Instead, Hercule Poirot prepared to travel, to listen, to observe, and to think. Somewhere within the corridors of Morningside House, the truth waited patiently, concealed beneath routine, politeness, and fear. And Poirot had never failed to uncover the truth. Once he decided it must be found. Chapter 2. A sister's desperation. The journey to the neighbouring village was not a long one, yet Hercule Poirot used every minute of it productively. As the bus wound through narrow country roads and past hedgerows just beginning to bloom, his mind replayed the contents of Ellen Preston's letter with methodical precision. Desperation, he knew, could cloud judgment, but it could also sharpen truth. The question was which applied here. When he finally disembarked, Poirot consulted the directions carefully written at the bottom of the letter. A short walk led him beyond the village green, past a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water, and onto a narrow lane edged with poplar trees. At the very end stood a modest cottage with whitewashed walls and a neatly kept garden. Poirot paused a moment before approaching. The flowers were arranged with care, though not abundance. This was not a home of wealth, but of discipline and pride. He knocked gently. After a brief delay, the door opened to reveal a thin woman in her early 40s. Her face bore the marks of long nights without sleep, eyes rimmed with fatigue, lips drawn tight in worry. When she saw Poirot, her expression shifted instantly from caution to fragile hope. "Mr. Poirot?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Yes, madame," he replied kindly. "You are Ellen Preston." She nodded and stepped aside at once. "Please, come in. Thank you for coming. I hardly believed you would." Poirot entered the small sitting room, noting its simplicity. The furniture was worn but clean, arranged carefully. A teapot and 2 mismatched cups waited on the table, untouched. She had been waiting. Ellen Preston gestured for him to sit, then clasped her hands tightly, as if afraid they might betray her nerves. "I don't know where to begin," she said. "Then begin at the beginning," Poirot replied gently, "and do not concern yourself with order. I will find that myself." She inhaled deeply. "My sister's name is Margaret. We've always called her Meg. She's younger than I am. After our mother passed away last year, things became difficult. I have only a small widow's pension. When Meg found work at Morningside House, it felt like a blessing." Poirot nodded, listening intently. "She was proud of that position," Ellen continued. "She wrote to me often. At first, she spoke well of the place. Large houses can be intimidating, but Meg tried very hard. She's always been gentle, quiet, not the sort to cause trouble." "And Mr. Lawrence Dane?" Poirot asked softly. Ellen's expression tightened. "He was difficult, and that much Meg admitted. He found fault in small things, the tea, the way his desk was arranged, even how quietly she walked. She tried to please him. She always did." Poirot observed the way Ellen spoke her sister's name, with instinctive protectiveness rather than defensiveness. It was a telling distinction. "Did she ever express fear of him?" Poirot asked. "Not fear," Ellen replied after a moment's thought. "More worry. In her last letter, she said he'd threatened to dismiss her. She was terrified of losing the job. Without it, we would have nothing." She looked down at her hands. She blamed herself. Said perhaps she hadn't been attentive enough. Poirot sighed quietly. "Often, those with the kindest hearts accept blame too easily." Ellen nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Then came that terrible day. The police arrived here before Meg's letter ever could. They told me she'd been found in his study, holding a knife. They said it was obvious what had happened." Poirot's eyes sharpened slightly. "Obvious," he repeated. "Yes," Ellen said bitterly. "They didn't listen when I said she would never hurt anyone. They said grief makes people say many things." "And what did Meg tell you herself?" Poirot asked. "She said she found him already on the floor. She didn't even remember picking up the knife, only that everything felt unreal. She said she panicked. She screamed. Then people rushed in and looked at her as if she were a monster." Her voice broke. Poirot allowed a respectful silence to pass before speaking again. "Did Meg ever mention any other troubles in the household? Quarrels? Unusual behavior?" Ellen hesitated. "She said the house felt tense, like everyone was waiting for something to happen." Mr. Dane argued with his wife often, his daughter too. Meg didn't know the details. She kept her distance. Servants notice things even when they pretend not to. "Indeed," Poirot said quietly. "They notice more than anyone." Ellen looked at him with renewed hope. "You believe her, don't you?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He leaned back, folding his hands. "I believe," he said carefully, "that your sister has not been proven guilty. And that is a very important distinction." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "What will you do?" "I will visit Morningside House," Poirot replied. "I will speak with those who lived under the same roof as Mr. Dane. Houses such as that," he added thoughtfully, "do not keep their secrets well. One must only listen." Ellen reached across the table, gripping Poirot's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you. Whatever happens, thank you for trying." Poirot rose, offering her a reassuring nod. "Courage, madame. Truth is patient, but it does not like to remain hidden forever." As he left the cottage and walked back toward the lane, Poirot's thoughts churned. The pattern was emerging already. A troubled household, financial strain, strained relationships, and a convenient suspect. "The maid," he murmured, "always the maid." He adjusted his hat and continued on his way, his resolve firm. The next step would be the house itself, Morningside. And Poirot suspected that within its walls, far more than one shadow lay waiting to be examined. Chapter 3. The house that watched in silence. Morningside House stood apart from the village, set back behind tall iron gates and a winding gravel drive that curved deliberately, as though wishing to delay arrivals. Hercule Poirot observed this with interest as the motorcar conveyed him toward the entrance. Houses, he believed, often revealed their nature before one ever crossed the threshold. This one was proud, imposing, and guarded. The structure itself was handsome in an austere way. Pale stone walls rose in clean lines, interrupted by tall windows that reflected the overcast sky like watchful eyes. A clipped hedge bordered the grounds with military precision, and not a leaf lay out of place. Yet, despite the order, Poirot felt a distinct absence of warmth. "Too perfect," he murmured. "That is always suspicious." The car came to a halt near the front steps. Poirot descended slowly, straightening his coat and surveying the entrance. The door was opened almost at once by a middle-aged butler whose posture was impeccable, though his eyes carried a hint of fatigue. "Yes," the man said, his tone reserved. "Hercule Poirot," Poirot replied smoothly. "I believe my visit is expected." The butler hesitated just a fraction too long before nodding. "Indeed, sir. Mr. Dane's widow will receive you." Poirot was led through a wide hall adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Their eyes followed him with faint disapproval, as though judging his intrusion. The air smelled faintly of polish and old books, clean but heavy with history. As they walked, Poirot allowed his gaze to wander. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its ticking loud in the silence. The sound struck him as oddly irregular, as if recently disturbed. Mental note, Poirot thought. They entered a sitting room where the curtains were half drawn, dimming the afternoon light. Mrs. Dane rose from her chair as Poirot entered. She was a tall woman in mourning black, her figure rigid, her expression composed to the point of severity. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "thank you for coming." "Madame," Poirot replied with a courteous bow. "Please accept my condolences." She inclined her head briefly. "This has been a most distressing time." Poirot took his seat, studying her discreetly. Grief was present, yes, but controlled, contained. There were no signs of hysteria, no visible collapse. Instead, he sensed tension, like a tightly wound spring. "You wished to speak with me?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Mrs. Dane said. "Though I must admit I do not understand why. The matter is already in the hands of the authorities." "Of course," Poirot said mildly. "And yet, you agreed to see me." She paused. "I did, because uncertainty is unpleasant." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we are aligned in our desires." A silence followed. Poirot chose not to fill it immediately. Silence, he knew, often compelled others to speak. Eventually, Mrs. Dane continued. "My husband was a demanding man. He expected excellence that sometimes led to misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" Poirot echoed. "An interesting word." She stiffened slightly. "Are you suggesting otherwise?" "I suggest nothing yet, madam," Poirot replied calmly. "I observe." Before she could respond, the door opened and a young woman entered. She was in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back sharply and eyes that held a restless intensity. "My daughter, Clara," Mrs. Dane said. "She insisted on being present." Clara did not wait to be invited. She seated herself abruptly, crossing her arms. "So," she said, studying Poirot with open skepticism. "You're the famous detective." Poirot inclined his head. "I am sometimes called that." Clara's lips curved in something like a smile. "Then you're here to prove the maid innocent?" Mrs. Dane shot her daughter a warning glance. "Clara." "What?" Clara replied sharply, Everyone's thinking it. Either Meg did it or she didn't, and if she didn't, then someone else did. Poirot's eyes brightened slightly. You are refreshingly direct, mademoiselle. Clara shrugged. My father disliked that about me. Poirot turned his attention back to Mrs. Dane. Perhaps you might tell me about the day of the incident. Mrs. Dane folded her hands carefully. It was entirely ordinary, until it wasn't. Lawrence had been in his study all morning. He disliked interruptions. Around noon, there was shouting. Shouting? Poirot repeated. Yes, Clara interjected. My parents were arguing again. Mrs. Dane's jaw tightened. That is not relevant. Poirot raised a hand gently. On the contrary, madame, raised voices often precede unfortunate events. Mrs. Dane exhaled slowly. Very well, we disagreed. About finances, about control of the estate. And then? Poirot prompted. I left him alone, she said. Later, the maid screamed. Poirot nodded. Who arrived first? The cook and I, Mrs. Dane replied. Clara was upstairs. And what did you see? Poirot asked. Clara leaned forward now. We saw Meg standing there like she'd turned to stone. My father was on the floor. The knife, our letter opener, was in her hand. Poirot noted the phrasing carefully. You say our letter opener, he said. So it belonged in the study? Yes, Mrs. Dane said. It was kept on his desk. Poirot clasped his hands. And was anything else disturbed? Mrs. Dane hesitated. I did not notice. But you, mademoiselle? Poirot asked, turning to Clara. Clara frowned. The papers were scattered. That wasn't normal. My father was obsessive about order. Poirot's moustache twitched almost imperceptibly. Order, he murmured. Yes, a man who values order does not leave chaos behind unless something interrupts him. He rose from his chair. With your permission, I would like to see the study. Mrs. Dane exchanged a glance with her daughter, then nodded reluctantly. As Poirot followed them down the corridor, he became acutely aware of the house's silence. It was the silence of people holding their breath, of walls that had witnessed too much and said nothing. But Poirot intended to make them speak. Chapter 4. The Study and the Shadows. The study lay at the far end of the east wing, separated from the family rooms by a long corridor lined with framed landscapes. As Hercule Poirot walked, he noticed how the air itself seemed heavier here, as though the house remembered what had occurred and resisted intrusion. Mrs. Dane moved stiffly ahead, her steps measured, while Clara followed with restless impatience. This room has not been altered, Mrs. Dane said as she opened the door. The police instructed us to leave it as it was. Poirot inclined his head. That is most considerate of them. The study was large and square, its tall windows facing the garden. Heavy curtains were pulled back, allowing pale daylight to fall across a broad oak desk. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents arranged with meticulous care, volumes evenly spaced, spines aligned with obsessive precision. Except for the desk, Poirot stopped just inside the doorway. Papers lay scattered across its surface and onto the floor, as if swept aside in a moment of agitation. An inkwell had tipped over, leaving a dark stain that had been carefully blotted, but not entirely erased. The chair behind the desk sat at an unnatural angle, half-turned, as though pushed back suddenly. Poirot breathed in slowly. Yes, he said quietly. Something happened here. Clara crossed her arms. That's what I told them, but they barely looked. They saw the knife and stopped thinking. Poirot moved forward, careful not to disturb anything. He examined the desk first. The scattered papers were mostly financial documents, ledgers, correspondence, legal notices. His eyes lingered on one letter in particular, its corner torn as though ripped hastily. May I? Poirot asked. Mrs. Dane hesitated, then nodded. Poirot lifted the letter gently and read it. The contents were brief but firm, a demand for repayment, written by a business associate. The deadline had already passed. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Pressure." Mrs. Dane stiffened. "My husband had many dealings. That proves nothing." "On the contrary," Poirot replied calmly, "it proves motive exists somewhere in this room." He turned his attention to the floor. Near the desk lay a small rug, its edge slightly folded. Poirot knelt, adjusting it carefully. Beneath, the wooden floor bore a faint scuff mark, long and shallow. "Someone moved quickly," he said. "Perhaps stood, perhaps fell." Clara frowned. "My father wasn't clumsy." "No," Poirot agreed, "but he may have been surprised." Poirot rose and walked toward the fireplace. On the mantel stood several objects arranged symmetrically: a clock, 2 brass ornaments, and a framed photograph. He studied the clock closely. "Was this clock working before the incident?" he asked. Mrs. Dane exchanged a glance with her daughter. "Yes." Poirot tilted his head. "And now?" "It stopped that day," Clara said. "The police didn't care." Poirot smiled faintly. "They rarely do." He examined the clock face. The time had frozen at 20 minutes past 12. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting." He stepped back and surveyed the room as a whole. "Tell me," he said, turning to Mrs. Dane, "who had access to this study?" "My husband, of course," she replied. "And occasionally myself. Clara was discouraged from entering." Clara scoffed. "Discouraged doesn't mean forbidden." Poirot's eyes flicked toward her. "Indeed." "And the staff?" Poirot asked. "The maid, Margaret, entered to clean," Mrs. Dane said. "The butler, the cook, but only at certain times." "Which time was Margaret expected to be here?" Poirot asked. "Late morning," Mrs. Dane replied. "She was to dust and then leave him to work." Poirot nodded. "And was she punctual?" "Yes," Mrs. Dane said quickly. Too quickly. Poirot noticed. "Madame," he said gently, "when you entered this room after hearing the scream, where exactly was Margaret standing?" Mrs. Dane closed her eyes briefly. "Near the desk." "And your husband?" "On the floor." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Between the desk and the door?" "Yes." Poirot walked the distance slowly, measuring each step. He stopped near the spot Mrs. Dane indicated. "If Margaret stood here," he said, "and Mr. Dane lay there, then the knife would have had to fall into her hand or be placed there." Clara's breath caught. "Placed?" Poirot turned to her. "A person in shock may pick up an object without understanding why, but a person wishing to direct blame might do the same, with intention." Mrs. Dane's face drained of colour. "Are you accusing—" "I accuse no one," Poirot interrupted softly. "Not yet." He moved toward the window. Outside, the garden paths were neatly trimmed, the hedges cut with ruthless precision. "Order," Poirot murmured. "Your husband valued it greatly." "Yes," Mrs. Dane said. "He demanded it." "And yet," Poirot continued, "on this day, order failed him." He turned back to them. "Did Mr. Dane intend to dismiss Margaret?" Mrs. Dane hesitated. "He mentioned it." Clara's eyes flashed. "He threatened her. I heard him." Poirot inclined his head. "Threats create fear. Fear creates mistakes." He looked once more around the study, committing every detail to memory: the papers, the clock, the scuffed floor. "This room tells a story," he said quietly, "but it is incomplete. Someone removed a chapter." Mrs. Dane folded her arms defensively. "What happens now?" "Now," Poirot replied, "I speak to the staff, because servants see what families pretend does not exist." He turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing," he added. The truth did not enter this room with the maid. It was already here, waiting. And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out of the study, leaving behind a room heavy with secrets, and a family growing increasingly uneasy about what those secrets might reveal. Chapter 5. Voices Below the Stairs. The servants' hall lay beneath the main staircase, tucked away from the polished corridors and carefully framed portraits of Morningside House. Hercule Poirot descended the steps slowly, attentive to every sound. Here the air was warmer, tinged with the faint aromas of bread and soap. Life continued in practical rhythms below, even while uncertainty hovered above. The butler, Mr. Henshaw, awaited him near a long wooden table. He was a tall man with silvered hair and a posture that suggested discipline ingrained over decades. Nearby stood the cook, Mrs. Ellery, sturdy and watchful, her arms folded as if guarding her thoughts. A younger footman lingered by the doorway, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. Poirot greeted them politely and took a seat, placing his hat beside him. "I thank you for your time," he said. "I will not keep you longer than necessary, provided you answer me with honesty." The butler inclined his head. "Of course, sir." Poirot began with simple questions. "How long have each of you served at Morningside?" 32 years, Mr. Henshaw replied at once. "Under Mr. Dane's father, and his father before him?" Mrs. Ellery nodded. 10 years for me." "2," said the footman quietly. Poirot smiled faintly. "Longevity often brings clarity. Let us begin with the morning in question. Mr. Henshaw, where were you at midday?" "In the pantry," the butler answered, "preparing luncheon service." "And did you hear anything unusual?" "A raised voice," Henshaw admitted. "Mr. Dane's. That was not uncommon." Poirot's eyes flicked to Mrs. Ellery. "You, madam?" "I was kneading dough," she said. "But I heard shouting too, sharp words, then silence." "How long after the silence did the scream come?" Poirot asked. Mrs. Ellery considered. "A minute, perhaps 2. Poirot nodded and turned to the footman. "And you?" "I was polishing the silver upstairs," the young man said nervously. "I saw Miss Clara pass the corridor. She looked upset." Clara again, Poirot thought. "Did you see Margaret?" Poirot asked. "Yes," the footman said. "Earlier she was carrying a tray toward the study." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Was that her usual duty at that hour?" The footman hesitated. "Not exactly. She usually cleaned the study earlier, but Mr. Dane rang the bell." Mrs. Ellery's lips pressed together. "He did that when he wanted someone immediately." Poirot made a note. "So Margaret went when summoned?" "Yes," the footman said. "Tell me about Margaret," Poirot said gently. "What sort of girl was she?" Mrs. Ellery answered first. "Quiet, hard-working, always anxious to please. Too anxious, if you ask me." Henshaw nodded. "She took criticism badly, not insolent, just frightened." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Frightened of whom?" Another pause. "Mr. Dane," Mrs. Ellery said at last. He could be cruel with words. Poirot allowed silence to settle again, watching their expressions. "Did Mr. Dane quarrel with anyone else?" he asked. Mrs. Ellery glanced toward the door. "His wife, often." "And his daughter?" "Sometimes," the cook admitted. "Miss Clara did not agree with him." Poirot folded his hands. "Disagreement can escalate, particularly where money is involved." The butler cleared his throat. "Sir, there were rumours." Poirot looked at him attentively. "Rumours have a way of pointing toward truth. Speak." Henshaw hesitated, then continued. "Mr. Dane was in difficulty, financially. Letters arrived frequently. He disliked us touching them." Poirot remembered the torn paper on the desk. "And who knew of these troubles?" Poirot asked. "The family," Henshaw said. and perhaps others. Poirot rose slowly. One more question. After the scream, what did you do? I ran, Mrs. Ellery said. We all did. And when you arrived? Poirot asked. Margaret stood frozen, Henshaw replied. She looked lost. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Shock can do that. He thanked them and dismissed the footman. Mrs. Ellery lingered a moment. Sir, she said quietly, Margaret did not have the strength for such violence. Poirot inclined his head. Strength, madame, is not always measured in muscle. When Poirot returned upstairs, he found Clara standing near the window overlooking the drive. She turned as he approached, her expression guarded. You spoke to them, she said. Yes. And, she pressed. And they fear the truth, Poirot replied calmly. As many do. Clara folded her arms. You think someone here did it? Poirot met her gaze. I think the household is bound by silence. Her jaw tightened. My mother won't like that. Truth rarely pleases everyone, Poirot said. He walked toward the stairs, then paused. Mademoiselle, where were you precisely when your father died? Her eyes flickered. In my room. Alone? Yes. Reading? Poirot asked. She hesitated. Packing. Packing, Poirot repeated softly. For a journey not yet taken? Clara's face hardened. You're twisting things. I'm aligning them, Poirot replied gently. That evening, alone in his guest room, Poirot reviewed the day. A frightened maid, a demanding employer, financial strain, a daughter restless for escape, a wife guarding composure too carefully, and time, frozen at 20 minutes past 12. Poirot closed his notebook. The truth approaches, he murmured, and when it arrives, someone will no longer be able to pretend. Outside, the lights of Morningside House glowed steadily, unaware that their quiet order was beginning to unravel. Chapter 6. Time, Truth, and the Unseen. Hand night settled over Morningside House with deceptive calm. The corridors were hushed, the servants retired to their quarters, and even the old floorboards seemed reluctant to creak. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the small guest room assigned to him, a lamp casting a warm circle of light over his notebook. Time, he reflected, was the silent witness in every crime. He reopened his notes and studied the single detail that troubled him most. The clock in the study, frozen at 20 minutes past 12. Clocks did not stop without reason. Either they were interfered with, or something violent occurred near enough to disrupt their mechanism. Poirot rose, his decision made. The house was quiet as he stepped into the corridor. He moved without haste, listening. At the end of the passage, a door creaked softly. Poirot paused, then continued toward the east wing. The study greeted him with the same oppressive stillness. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, tracing pale shapes across the desk and floor. Poirot approached the mantel and examined the clock once more. He tilted it carefully, listening for the faint sound of loose metal. A thin rattle answered him. Ah, Poirot murmured. You have been disturbed, not broken. He returned the clock to its place and turned his attention to the desk. The financial papers he had seen earlier were neatly stacked now, as though someone had attempted to restore order. Someone nervous. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He stepped back and surveyed the room again, but this time from a different angle. He positioned himself where Margaret had allegedly stood, then traced the line of sight to the door, the desk, the window. No, he said softly. Not possible. A person of Margaret's slight build could not have struck with sufficient force from that position. The geometry was wrong. The wound, described carefully in the coroner's report Poirot had requested, required proximity and leverage. Someone else had been closer. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Poirot turned as the door opened. Mrs. Dane stood there, her candle illuminating a face strained by sleeplessness. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "Madame." "You are looking for proof," she said, "to unsettle what has already been decided." "I am looking for truth," Poirot replied gently. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Lawrence was not an easy man, she admitted. Living with him was exhausting. Poirot studied her carefully. "And yet you remained?" "I had no choice," she said sharply. "The estate, the obligations, everything was bound to him." "And his finances?" Poirot asked. She stiffened. "You know." "I suspect," Poirot said calmly. "But I would prefer confirmation." Mrs. Dane sighed. "We were nearly ruined. He refused to sell. He insisted appearances be maintained." "And your daughter?" Poirot asked. "Did she know?" "Yes," Mrs. Dane said reluctantly. "She blamed him." Poirot nodded. "Blame is a powerful motivator." Mrs. Dane's voice dropped. "You think Clara did it?" "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that someone intervened during an argument. Someone familiar with the study. Someone quick." Mrs. Dane turned away. "Clara loved her father despite everything." "Love and resentment often coexist," Poirot replied softly. Silence stretched between them. At last Mrs. Dane spoke again. "Margaret was in the wrong place." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Yes, very much so." Mrs. Dane faced him. "If the truth comes out, everything will be destroyed." Poirot met her eyes steadily. "Madame, destruction has already occurred. What remains is repair." She extinguished the candle with trembling fingers and left without another word. The following morning, Poirot requested to visit the village constable. The man was polite but skeptical. "The evidence is clear," the constable insisted. "The maid had the weapon." "Evidence," Poirot replied, "is not the same as conclusion." He requested the report of the time of death once more. The constable obliged. "Between 12 and past," Poirot read aloud, "a range broad enough to hide a lie." Returning to Morningside, Poirot encountered Clara in the garden. She paced angrily, boots crushing gravel. "You spoke to my mother," she said. "Yes." "She's frightened," Clara snapped. "She always is." "Fear suggests knowledge," Poirot replied. Clara stopped. "My father was going to send Margaret away. She begged him to wait. I heard her crying." Poirot's eyes softened. "And then?" "And then my mother went to the study," Clara said bitterly. "I stayed outside. I heard shouting again." Poirot stepped closer. "Did you enter the study?" Clara hesitated. "Not until after." Poirot studied her face. "Mademoiselle, someone else was present when your father fell." Clara's voice shook. "You're saying my mother." "I am saying," Poirot interrupted gently, "that the truth requires courage." Clara turned away, tears streaking her face. That afternoon, Poirot visited Margaret in the holding cell. She looked small and pale, her eyes hollow. "I didn't do it," she whispered. "I know," Poirot said simply. Her breath caught. "You heard shouting?" Poirot said. "Then silence, then a scream." She nodded. "I found him. I touched the knife without thinking." Poirot smiled sadly. "The hand obeys before the mind." As Poirot left, his path was clear. Time had stopped at 20 minutes past 12 because someone had struck the clock in a moment of violence. That person was not the maid. That person lived upstairs. And soon the house would have to answer for it. Chapter 7. The Arrangement of Truth. Morning light entered Morningside House cautiously, as though unsure it was welcome. Hercule Poirot stood near the foot of the main staircase, hat in hand, waiting. He had requested that the household assemble in the drawing room, family and senior staff alike. Such gatherings, he knew, concentrated tension into a single space, where truth found it harder to hide. They arrived one by one. Mrs. Dane entered first, composed but pale, her hands clasped tightly before her. Clara followed, her expression guarded, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Mr. Henshaw stood stiffly near the wall, Mrs. Ellery beside him, lips pressed into a thin line. The constable, summoned from the village, took a seat near the door, his skepticism barely concealed. Poirot waited until the room settled into uneasy silence. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began calmly, "thank you for coming. I will be brief, but precise." No one spoke. "You are all aware," Poirot continued, "that Margaret Preston has been accused of killing Mr. Lawrence Dane. You are also aware that the case appears, at first glance, very simple." Clara shifted in her chair. "But," Poirot said, raising a finger slightly, "simple cases are very often complicated ones wearing clever disguises." He paced slowly, his voice measured. "Let us consider time. The clock in the study stopped at 20 minutes past 12, not because it was broken, but because it was struck violently during a struggle." The constable frowned. "That proves nothing." "It proves proximity," Poirot replied calmly. "And opportunity." He turned toward Mrs. Dane. "Madame, you argued with your husband that morning." Mrs. Dane did not deny it. "We often argued." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but this argument concerned money, debt, the possible loss of everything you had worked to preserve." Her jaw tightened. Poirot continued. "Margaret was summoned to the study. She arrived to find Mr. Dane already under great strain. Words were exchanged. He threatened dismissal. Fear overwhelmed her. Margaret, seated quietly near the door under guard, lowered her eyes. But Margaret did not strike Mr. Dane, Poirot said firmly. She lacked both the position and the intent. He turned now to Clara. "You, mademoiselle, were not in your room packing when your father died." Clara stiffened. "You can't prove that." "No," Poirot said gently. "But I do not need to." He faced the room as a whole. After Margaret left, or attempted to, another person entered the study, a person with authority, a person already furious. Mrs. Dane's breath caught. This second confrontation was not about dismissal, Poirot continued. It was about survival. He stepped closer to the mantelpiece. The blow that killed Mr. Dane occurred near the clock. The chair was pushed back. He fell awkwardly, striking his head. The letter opener, already on the desk, was seized afterward. Poirot paused, letting the words settle. Margaret screamed. In panic, someone placed the letter opener in her hand. The constable leaned forward. "You're accusing—" Poirot raised his hand. "I accuse no one without order." He turned slowly toward Mrs. Dane. "Madame," he said quietly, "you entered the study after Margaret. You confronted your husband. In anger, you pushed him. You did not intend to kill him." Mrs. Dane's composure shattered. She sank into a chair, her face drained of color. "I didn't mean—" she whispered. "He wouldn't listen. He never listened." Clara stood abruptly. "Mother!" "I did it," Mrs. Dane said, tears falling freely now. "I pushed him. He fell. When I saw the maid standing there, frozen, I thought only of Clara, of the house." Silence filled the room. Poirot nodded slowly. "Fear makes quick decisions seem reasonable." The constable rose. "Mrs. Dane, you are under arrest." As she was led away, Clara collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly. Poirot turned toward Margaret. "You are free, mademoiselle." Margaret looked up in disbelief, then covered her face with trembling hands. As the room slowly emptied, Poirot remained by the window, gazing out at the grounds. Order would return to Morningside House, but not the kind it once knew. Truth, he reflected, rearranged everything. And sometimes that was the only justice that mattered. Chapter 8. After the silence. Morningside House did not exhale immediately after the truth was spoken. Instead, it seemed to hold itself rigid, as though unsure how to exist without the weight of deception pressing against its walls. The servants moved quietly, avoiding one another's eyes, and even the light entering through the tall windows appeared subdued, uncertain of its place. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the drawing-room, gazing at the empty chairs where accusation and confession had so recently taken form. The air still carried echoes of Mrs. Dane's breaking voice and Clara's restrained grief. Resolution, Poirot knew, was never as tidy as people imagined. Truth closed one wound while opening several others. The constable returned briefly to collect documents and issue instructions. Margaret Preston was released into Ellen's care before noon. The house staff watched her leave, some with relief, others with shame. She walked slowly, as though afraid the world might yet pull her back. Poirot did not accompany her. His work, here at least, was finished. Later that afternoon, Clara Dane approached him in the garden. She looked smaller now, stripped of defiance, her anger spent and replaced by exhaustion. She stopped a few steps away, uncertain. "You were right," she said quietly. "About everything." Poirot inclined his head. "Truth is rarely kind, mademoiselle, but it is necessary." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I thought if the house stayed intact, everything else would too. I didn't see what it was costing." Poirot studied her gently. "Houses can be rebuilt. Lives, once broken by injustice, cannot." Clara nodded, tears glistening but unshed. "What will happen now?" "That," Poirot replied, "is for time to decide, but it will not decide blindly." She thanked him softly and walked away down the path, her steps slow but steady. That evening, Poirot packed his belongings. He paused briefly in the guest room, looking once more at the carefully made bed, the untouched chair, the quiet order restored. Yet this order felt different, less rigid, more honest. As he descended the staircase for the last time, Mr. Henshaw waited near the door. "Sir," the butler said stiffly, "on behalf of the staff, thank you." Poirot smiled faintly. "Loyalty is admirable, monsieur, but never let it silence conscience." Outside, the car awaited him. The gates of Morningside House opened without ceremony, and the drive curved away once more, no longer delaying departure but easing it. The countryside rolled past as Poirot reflected on the case. No grand mastermind, no elaborate scheme, just pressure, fear, and one irreversible moment. Such cases troubled him the most, not because they were difficult, but because they were human. That night, Poirot returned to his quiet residence. The familiar order greeted him, the precise arrangement of furniture, the calm ticking of his mantel clock. He poured himself tea and sat, allowing the silence to settle. Justice, he knew, was not a performance. It was a correction. Somewhere, Margaret Preston slept free for the first time in weeks. Somewhere else, Clara faced a future without illusion. And somewhere between guilt and grief, truth rested, uncomfortable but real. Poirot closed his notebook. "The little grey cells," he murmured, "they exist not only to solve puzzles, but to protect the innocent." Outside, night deepened. Inside, order endured, not the fragile kind built on fear, but the quieter kind born of understanding. And so the mystery ended, not with triumph, but with clarity. For Hercule Poirot, that was enough. The case is closed, but the next mystery is already waiting. This is Unknown Suspect,